This episode is brought to you by Nebula.
We must fight the woke in our schools. We must fight the woke in our businesses. We must fight the woke in government agencies. We can never, ever surrender to woke ideology. And I'll tell you this, the state of Florida is where woke goes to die.
For over a year now, conservatives have been pushing a familiar narrative. Random people who are part of or considered to be in proximity to the LGBTQ community, trans women especially, are being accused of recruiting children into being gay or trans and labeled as groomers.
For grooming.
Groomer.
Grooming.
Groomers.
We've seen this narrative played out many times throughout history. But before we go into how this rhetoric works, it's important to be clear about its consequences. Because recently, violence against the LGBT community and anyone seen to be supporting it has been rapidly escalating. 2022 was a horrible year for violence against the LGBTQ community. Groups like the Proud Boys and Patriot Front have been showing up armed outside of drag brunches more and more frequently. Many LGBT teachers and parents have been doxxed and harassed after videos of them were posted online to millions of angry conservatives on accounts like Libs of TikTok. And of course, November saw the horrific shooting at the gay bar Club Q in Colorado. Hundreds of events have had to be canceled because of threats, and anti-LGBT legislation, specifically targeting the trans community, has been on the rise. For the graph people out there, in 2022, the ACLED found that since 2020 and 2021, anti-LGBTQ political violence, demonstrations, and the involvement of far-right militias in anti-LGBT activities have all gone up, with over 200 incidents last year alone. For yet another consecutive year, hate crimes of this kind are going up, and the increase in anti-LGBTQ rhetoric has a lot to do with it. We know this because this is something that multiple studies have confirmed. When there is an increase in rhetoric targeting a specific, usually minority group, hate crimes against that group go up. But these are large trends, and in some cases, this link between rhetoric and increased violence is just obvious and undeniable.
This is a threat that came in via encrypted email tonight.
For example, take what happened to the Boston Children's Hospital. Last August, the Twitter account Libs of TikTok started posting about the hospital, and claiming, incorrectly, that minors were receiving hysterectomies there. To be completely clear, and I'm quoting the Boston Globe here, the types of gender-affirming care that Boston Children's Hospital offers ranges from simple interventions such as allowing patients to use preferred names and pronouns in their medical records, to counseling, hormonal therapy to delay puberty, or transition to a different gender. For patients 15 and older, breast surgery is an option, as is genital surgery for those 18 and older. Nothing that is shocking or out of line with the recommendations of several credible medical associations. And these measures have been shown to decrease the risk of suicide for the recipients of gender-affirming care by as much as 73%. This care is literally life-saving, and only 3% of those who receive it detransition permanently, with less than half of 1% of trans patients reporting surgical regret. Just keep that in mind throughout the rest of the video. Anyway, Libs of TikTok, if you don't already know, is an account that regularly posts TikTok clips accusing LGBTQ teachers and parents of being groomers, which, for some reason, frequently gets it featured on Tucker Carlson's show.
Libs of TikTok.
Libs of TikTok. And Libs of TikTok, honestly, well, it's a Twitter account, but it's become one of the most important sites of reporting in the new media.
Last August, the account started targeting the Boston Children's Hospital with these bogus hysterectomy claims. And right away, the hospital was on the receiving end of a wave of harassment, phone calls, emails, and death threats, eventually escalating into a bomb threat that shut down the hospital while the staff and the family of the patients had to wonder what would happen to everyone in the building. Just imagine for a second how disruptive a bomb threat can be in a hospital where you have risky medical procedures like surgery going on. This is a big deal. And despite this clear link between targeted rhetoric and harassment, accounts like Libs of TikTok haven't stopped. The Boston Children's Hospital has continued to receive bomb threats for months since that first incident. And Chaya Raichik, the person behind the Libs of TikTok account, has directed the attention of her followers, and therefore the same storm of death threats, towards at least one other hospital in Washington. Tucker Carlson, too, with his millions of viewers every weeknight, has done the same thing, running segments with the header, "Hospitals are mutilating children," and drumming up the same kind of anger and threats of violence to hospitals all around the country. There's an obvious link. Libs of TikTok and Carlson talk about a hospital, and it immediately suffers a wave of threats. We've seen this story multiple times at this point. The effect is predictable. There is no more denying the link. But that hasn't stopped Carlson and Rhetoric from encouraging this violence. But it's not always this direct. The current trend in violence against LGBTQ people has been happening through a much more generalized association between queer people, trans women especially, and pedophilia. Let me explain how this works. There are 3 steps to the process. First, you associate queer people with pedophilia over and over and over and over again. Second, you attach this topic to a larger culture war fixation, turning it into a moral panic threatening to undermine the very fabric of society. And third, you bring in the vigilantes and legitimize state violence. So first, it starts by associating LGBTQ people with grooming. For this, accounts like Libs of TikTok are an obvious starting point. Just scrolling through Rhetoric's feed, you'll see that just about every post on her page is attacking someone in the LGBTQ community. And every accusation of grooming is directed at a queer person. Same goes for Tucker Carlson segments.
California Teachers Association is one of the most powerful unions in the country, and it is purely an organ of the Democratic Party. Recently, the union held a conference to discuss how to indoctrinate school children without their parents' knowledge. One first-grade teacher called Blair Wyatt explained that it's best to hold meetings for gender identity clubs during lunchtime so that parents never know.
And same goes for Laura Ingraham segments, who, in this next clip, implies that accepting trans youth would somehow lead to the lowering of the age of consent.
And if children can choose this, then the next thing is going to be choosing consent for sexual activity. If they can choose this, then why can't they make other choices? I mean, there's a lot to this story. Guys, thanks so much. Yes. Coming up.
In all these clips, in all the TikToks featured on Rhetoric's account, the same associations are constantly reinforced. Queer equals grooming. To try and preserve plausible deniability, these hosts will often say something quick like this.
There's nothing to do with gay people.
But don't be fooled. A story on Fox only becomes a case of grooming when a queer person or a member of the LGBTQ community is involved. Remember, at Hooters, on Sundays, kids eat free. Okay, we're getting out of here. I don't feel like getting shot talking about gender in Hooters. The idea behind this rhetoric isn't necessarily to claim that every single queer person is a groomer, but just that they're more likely to be. This, in turn, justifies increased suspicion of the LGBT community, increased policing, and therefore, increased violence. And it all rests on the false idea that simply being queer constitutes a sexual act. Being straight or cisgender has nothing to do with sex. In the conservative imagination, it's just a neutral condition of being. But by contrast, being gay, trans, or queer in any fashion has an innate sexual character. And this is obviously wrong. Attraction and gender identity have little to do with sex. At least no more for a queer person than for a straight or cisgender person.
What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick. You see, Ralph was a homosexual.
But by appealing to this widespread assumption and years of association in media and politics between queerness and pedophilia in successive moral panics in the 50s, 70s, and 80s, conservatives can make it seem like being out in a space where kids might be constitutes child abuse. And if that seems a little far-fetched, they can fall back on the implication that child abuse is more likely to happen when queer people are around children. And therefore, they can justify to their audiences the criminalization and violence committed against those in the LGBT community who are out on the pretext of catching bad apples, forcing as many queer people as possible back into the closet while keeping a new generation in the closet indefinitely. And I hate that I feel the need to specify this, but queer people are of course not more likely to commit acts of child abuse. There is empirical evidence for this statement that should be immediately obvious to most people. But constantly trying to create a link between LGBT people and grooming is only step one. The next part of the process involves tying that narrative to something bigger. In other words, this problem is everywhere.
Once again, this is everywhere.
For a media narrative to become a moral panic, it has to become universalizing and apocalyptic. And to do that, moral panics tend to rely on a few tropes. For starters, the stories that become the focus of the moral panic have to seem a little ridiculous, maybe even laughable. They have to be absurd, but they need to be clearly shown as dangerous nonetheless. Society-threatening even. And it helps if it seems like they're backed by a large system of money, influence, and power. For our current moral panic, the term woke often becomes the point where all these narratives coalesce. Woke is a great word because you can apply it to pretty much whatever you want. If the M&Ms aren't smoking hot anymore, it's because of woke ideology. If a balloon doesn't get shot down fast enough, it's because of woke bureaucrats. And if any movie or video game dares to feature someone who doesn't look like their ancestors ate, drank, lived, and breathed potatoes, it might as well not exist. Woke is a catch-all under which you can fit the most ridiculous, insignificant story and the most important mass mobilizations against discrimination of our century haphazardly. Everything can be brought under the same roof and seem like it's all contributing to the same apocalyptic, dystopian destruction of humanity, even when nothing is happening but a reasonable demand for equality, inclusion, and safety. Woke serves as the bridge into every slippery slope fallacy, and is the word that takes any topic and makes it dystopian. Just look at that Tucker Carlson clip again where he says, "This is everywhere."
Once again, this is everywhere.
The chyron reads, "Children's hospitals are sexually mutilating kids." The graphic has free speech in a Ghostbusters stamp. And Tucker is literally saying, "This is everywhere." That shot is just a grab bag of whatever he thinks will inflame the panic of his audience. And he's not alone. Elon Musk has taken this a step further, calling wokeness a mind virus and a mortal threat to civilization a million times on Twitter. And in a segment that ends on the idiotic simplification that those on the left think biology is a theory, Bill Maher spends an agonizing 7 minutes pontificating about there being such a thing as a woke revolution that will spin out of control over a chyron that reads, "Purge overkill." It's almost unbelievable that anyone takes these dorks seriously, but millions of people do. And through a barrage of news stories, TV segments, and TikToks, every day in the US, millions of people are associating a supposedly totalizing threat to civilization with the existence of queer people who they believe to be abusing children and indoctrinating them. As if being gay or trans is something you're recruited into. Let me be clear, it's not. Conservatives panic at every slight increase in the number of people who identify as LGBTQ, and jump to the conclusion that there is some sort of mass recruitment effort, when the reality is that a greater societal acceptance has just made it safer to come out than before. The same thing happened with left-handedness. Once the stigma dissipated, and being left-handed stopped being punished so severely, more people started being left-handed all of a sudden, and no one was accusing left-handed teachers funded by the left-handed scissor lobby of indoctrinating all these kids. Because that would be ridiculous. But we haven't gotten to the part where this turns into violence yet. We have the foundation, an association between queerness and grooming, and the association of those two things with wokeness, making it a civilization-ending threat. Now, we can bring in the vigilantes.
Right now at 6, drag queen story time interrupted at an East Bay library. A hate crime investigation now underway.
Like I mentioned earlier, an increase in targeted and demonizing rhetoric is associated with a rise in hate crimes in a statistically significant way. And the same can be said of more extreme events like shootings. Once the groundwork has been laid, that basically any queer person can be considered guilty until proven innocent, and part of a plot that could literally end civilization, only two things are left to do. One, convince your audience that this goes all the way to the top, and therefore that the government, generally speaking, won't be there to stop it. And two, that it is therefore your responsibility to intervene, often in explicitly violent terms. The first is easy enough. As soon as someone like Biden calls out the increase in violence against the LGBT community and the increase in anti-LGBT rhetoric, conservative media will portray him as protecting groomers.
Does the Biden administration even know that American students can't do math anymore? We just saw the biggest drop of all time in math scores for 4th and 8th graders across the country. The Democrats closed the schools down and told all the students they were racists who needed sex changes. I wonder why they're failing algebra. It's almost like they want our children dumb and guilty and confused.
For an audience susceptible to QAnon-style conspiracies, it's not hard to guess what an open-ended statement like that might evoke. Basically, Democrats won't be there to protect kids, so what is left to do?
You shouldn't be talking to kindergartners about gender identity, especially if you're not their parents. That's creepy. You should be arrested for that, in fact. You talk to a normal person's kids about sex in kindergarten, you get beaten up. You should be beaten up. Please.
If I was a parent and my 5th grade daughter had to sleep and shower in some kind of cabin at some summer camp that I paid money to send my child to, and there was a man calling himself a woman sleeping in her cabin, showering with her, that guy he'd be in jail. He would be in jail. Well, first off, my husband would have beat him into the ground, and then he'd be in jail. But this is exactly how we need to stand up against this stuff.
No one should put up with this. No parent should put up with this for 1 second, no matter what the law says. Your duty, your moral duty, is to defend your children. This is an attack on your children, and you should fight back.
We can't just stand idly by while woke ideology ravages every institution in our society. We must fight the woke in our schools. We must fight the woke in our businesses.
When you put it all together, the consequence is obvious. It's stochastic terrorism. Acts of terrorism that are incited by the public demonization of a person or group and that cannot be predicted in detail, but are statistically highly probable. For millions of Americans, this kind of narrative will only have a small and personal effect. They will come to despise, or at the very least distrust, the LGBTQ community, and it will have almost no effect on their lives or the lives of those around them. For millions of others, this will turn into something they use as the basis for harassing queer people they see in their lives, or supporting candidates who promise to punish them. And invariably, for someone in the crowd, this is the call to action they need. The media figures they trust are telling them that there is a problem, that it is widespread, underground, and that it has the potential to destroy society. The government isn't doing anything to stop it. In fact, it's actively promoting it. And these same media figures they trust have just given them the green light to fight back, to make their home state the place where woke goes to die. They are begging for someone to go and beat people up. So eventually, somebody will. And you get shootings, and you get hate crimes, and armed far-right militias showing up at brunches to intimidate regular people back into the closet. Built into this model is plausible deniability. The call to action was never explicit. The specifics of the act of terror could not be predicted. But what other conclusion could be arrived at? How could hours upon hours of primetime television be devoted to this topic in these specific and dystopian terms without acts of terror happening? What else do these pundits expect? With this rhetoric, stochastic terrorism is inevitable, and they know it. The title of this video has the word fascism in it, and I want to address that as we wrap up. This groomer panic absolutely has to do with fascism. For one thing, a lot of the narratives used in the groomer panic map perfectly to those embraced by the fascist right throughout history. The classic fascist narrative is always about a once great society presently in a state of decline at the hands of an internal threat. In our case, the US needs to be made great again, and is under threat by woke ideology promoted by LGBT parents and teachers. These enemies are always aided by the socialist left, hence the attention to woke leftists in our current groomer panic. And the state is almost always depicted as simultaneously ineffectual and in cahoots with the conspiracy. The reason that this panic excites these same triggers is that heteronormativity, white supremacy, and the nuclear family are the foundations of the society fascists wish to uphold. All are brought into question by the acceptance of the LGBTQ community and the increased visibility and contesting of racism. This reckoning is therefore viewed by the far right as destabilizing, and thus it demands violent retaliation in order to protect the nation. In this case, embodied by the next generation, and these principles of white supremacy, heteronormativity, and the nuclear family. But it's more than just a similar narrative. This moral panic has mobilized literal fascists. Whether or not you personally consider this moral panic to have anything to do with fascism, fascists do. In response to this groomer narrative, far-right militias have assumed a sort of vigilante role, and are intimidating those targeted by the rhetoric, showing up armed to drag brunches, reading groups, and various pride events, causing many to shut down, and getting more and more people to fear for their lives. So-called lone wolves with far-right beliefs are also a part of that equation. less organized, but equally culpable in making LGBTQ spaces less safe and going beyond just threats. And if that wasn't enough, it's not just militias or individual actors participating in this effort. In Florida especially, but increasingly all over the country, state power has been marshaled to enact more and more policing of the LGBTQ community to complement what militias and lone wolves are doing. And if a shared narrative and the literal involvement of fascists weren't enough for you, there is an almost one-to-one Nazi analogy to link fascism with the current groomer panic. In Nazi Germany, the terms Jugendverführer and Jugendverderber, meaning seducer and corrupter of youth respectively, were used by the Nazis to demonize queer people. According to one historian, this trope depicted, quote, a uniquely dangerous figure who lured normal young men into depravity, and thus spread the epidemic of homosexuality. A lot of commonalities there already, but let's read a little further. In 1934, the rumor that homosexual cliques planned to seize power took hold, giving homosexuals another identity as enemies of the state. And as you can probably already predict, the wave of persecution that followed was dramatic and deeply animated by this rhetoric, and became one of the many tools that Nazi fascists used to develop their policing power. Queer people were sent to concentration camps wearing this pink upside-down triangle. They were imprisoned, and all manner of other sorts of violence were used by the Nazi Party and their sympathizers to stamp out of German society a so-called homosexual personality. Like today, the goal was not to eliminate all LGBT people, but to make their visible presence unacceptable by brutal violence, so that those who ever exhibited any trace of queer behavior, whatever that means, could be ruthlessly targeted. If you somehow don't feel concerned by this horrifying moment we're living in, consider this. Fascism requires an outgroup on which to pin the blame for all of society's woes. If tomorrow the narrative of trans grooming becomes ineffective, either because their repression will have become so totalizing or because the public will have moved on, there are plenty of other people left under the woke umbrella for the far right to focus its efforts on. It has proven it can be mobilized by this rhetoric into acts of violence. There is little reason to believe it won't be mobilized again against someone else it considers to be part of the threat on Western civilization. The rest of the LGBTQ community could be first up on the list, but attention could equally quickly shift to immigrants, socialists, Black Americans, non-traditional women, and the list can go on forever. Woke can mean roughly anything, and can be made infinitely dystopian, so anyone on the left of Tucker Carlson and any group resisting established modes of persecution can become a target. Fascism has rarely ever appeared fully formed. It takes time for the apparatus of evil to gain critical momentum. But we are already seeing its symptoms, and many people are already feeling the jackboot. If you've made it this far, I'd first like to thank you for watching all the way to the end. It really does help. I just want to briefly mention a few changes we're making here at Second Thought. First, as you might have noticed from this episode, I've just brought on a creative director to help spice up the videos and make them a little more engaging than just a stock footage compilation. We're also planning on doing more intense on-location shoots. For example, if you're watching this video on the day it was uploaded, we're currently in East Palestine, Ohio, shooting a mini-doc on the disastrous train derailment and the horrific effects it'll have on the region and the people who live there. Because we'll be making bigger, more in-depth videos, we're going to move to 2 uploads per month instead of once a week. This will give us the time we need to make each episode something special. Of course, going to twice a month means my AdSense revenue will be cut in half, which is extra difficult because I just hired someone full-time. If you'd like to help support the channel, the best possible way you can do that is by signing up for Nebula with the link below. Nebula is home to content from all your favorite creators, and it's a place where we can experiment and produce the content we really want to make, without the fear of age restriction or demonetization. I know for a fact that YouTube will demonetize my East Palestine video. It will most likely be age restricted too. That's why I'm so glad we have Nebula. I can put up meaningful content. I can help share the stories of people who are suffering and who have been left behind by those with the power to prevent these tragedies. YouTube doesn't care about that, but Nebula does. I'll also be putting up a bunch of behind-the-scenes content going forward. Stuff from the shoot that doesn't make the final cut, commentary from the crew, little things like that. Getting to see how videos are made has always been fascinating to me, so I'm excited to be able to share that with all of you. And now, if you sign up with my link, you'll also get access to the new Nebula classes, where creators host classes on how to be a creator. There's something for everyone, And it's another way for you to take a peek behind the scenes and see what really goes into making content. Your favorite creators teaching you how to create. In my opinion, that's pretty cool. Here's the heartfelt part. Every person who signs up using my link is directly contributing to the financial stability of the channel. Second Thought would not be possible without the generosity of viewers like you, especially since pretty much all my sponsors have bailed. And it doesn't take a huge investment to keep the lights on. If you sign up using the link below, you'll get access to Nebula and Nebula classes for under $3 a month. With my link, the annual plan is just $30 a year, or $2.50 a month. I honestly think that's an amazing deal for all the great content on Nebula. So if you'd like to help support this channel and get access to the streaming platform built and owned by the creators, sign up for Nebula using the link below. It really does help support me and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my other videos by following the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.